The CISSP exam expects that you are familiar with a wide variety of cyber attacks, including cryptanalytic attacks, mobile and wireless attacks, access control attacks, malicious code and application attacks, and you'll be expected to be familiar with countermeasures and prevention. So in the next hour, I'm going to touch on a wide variety of attacks from all 8 domains of the CISSP exam, touching on both key characteristics of the attacks themselves, as well as the effective countermeasures for those attacks. And for 2021 and beyond, we need to have that discussion about post-quantum cryptography. So if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to provide targeted coverage of post-quantum cryptography and quantum-resistant algorithms that may prove helpful on exam day. So today we're going to talk through the cyber attacks mentioned throughout the 8 domains of the CISSP exam content. We're going to touch on a few additional attacks and go a bit deeper than we did in the core lessons, and I'll touch on countermeasures because you will be expected to know each. And I'm really going to just help you by calling out some key characteristics that will help you on exam day with your recall. So just a minute of housekeeping here. If you're not familiar with the series, we have 8 core lessons, 1 for each exam domain. Should be very effective in helping you in 2021 as you prepare for the exam. There are several shorter supplemental lessons targeting the most challenging areas of the CISSP exam content. This is video number 7 in that supplemental series. I have videos out there in the supplemental batch on hacking your exam prep, which is my 2-week strategy. Very effective for me. Memorization tips, memory devices to help you with the most challenging memorization areas. A session dedicated to the quantitative risk analysis formulas, showing you those in the context of a real-world example because you will be expected to know them for the exam. A drill down into cryptography. Another covering the security models, processes, and frameworks for all 8 domains. Those processes have a lot of steps, some specific knowledge requirements there. This should be very helpful. And perhaps the most important video, mastering the CISSP mindset, answering that very difficult question, how do I think like a manager, in a very quantifiable way. I've had multiple students tell me this was the most important video they watched in their exam preparation. And after you take the exam, I'd love to hear if it helped you. As with all my lessons, there is a PDF copy of this presentation available for you in the video description. Do make sure to hit the bell and give us a like so you always get a heads up for the new videos. If you haven't taken our free 50-question practice quiz, that is available for you. Link in the video description. No login required. And if you haven't picked up the official study guide, make sure you grab a copy. For less than $60, it's the best deal in town. It has more than 1,000 practice questions. It has hundreds of flashcards. It's the best deal going for your prep. And housekeeping done, let's get into it. You'll need to be ready to explain common cryptanalytic attacks for the exam. In the past, with various sources, you may have heard these referred to as cryptographic attacks, another way of saying the same thing effectively. So just know that if you see cryptographic or cryptanalytic, 2 ways to talk about the same topic for our purposes here. So let's start with the brute force attack, which attempts to randomly find the correct cryptographic key by attempting all possible combinations, literally trial and error. Now you can make a brute force attack more effective by throwing some big hardware at it, some more compute power, and also rainbow tables. So rainbow tables are created by pre-computing hash representations of passwords and then creating a lookup table basically to accelerate the process of checking for weak passwords. And there are a few effective countermeasures, including cryptographic salts, CAPTCHA, which is that human-based challenge where you have to respond to a visual CAPTCHA sequence on your screen, throttling the rate of repeated logins. If we can only attempt every 30 seconds or minute, that slows the number of times a brute force attack can attempt to authenticate. And IP block list to just block a malicious host altogether. So the one there you may not be familiar with is cryptographic salts. We will touch on that topic at greater depth later in this session. Next up is the birthday attack, which is an attempt to find collisions in hash functions, commonly used in digital signature scenarios is a common target. And then the replay attack, which is an attempt to reuse authentication requests, as the description would indicate, commonly targeting authentication. So we can beat birthday attacks with long hash output, so essentially using effective hashing functions. So we wouldn't use MD5, for example, which is prone to collisions. Replay attack, there are several countermeasures. One commonly used is it's defeated with date timestamps. We'll touch on replay attacks again later in another category of attacks in this session. So I want to talk for a minute about two very different attacks with two very similar names. There is the meet in the middle attack. What you need to know about this one is it exploited protocols that use 2 rounds of encryption. It's actually one of the main reasons that 2DES was retired, which used 2 rounds of DES encryption. Now, on the other hand, man-in-the-middle attack, something you're going to hear about much more frequently, I would predict, is where you have both parties communicating with the attacker who sits between the two instead of directly with each other. This is commonly implemented through an unsecured public Wi-Fi router, an access point. So to avoid man-in-the-middle, you want to use only secure Wi-Fi, VPN. You can use secure HTTP, MFA, really anything that adds authentication or encryption to the scenario, right? But know the difference between these two for the exam. Know which is which. So now we're going to touch on a few cryptanalytic attacks with very similar sounding names. So we'll start with known plaintext, where the attacker has a copy of both the encrypted message along with the plaintext message used to generate the ciphertext. We then have the chosen ciphertext attack, where the attacker has the ability to decrypt chosen portions of the ciphertext message and then uses the decrypted portion to discover the key. And then there's the chosen plaintext attack, where the attacker can encrypt plaintext messages of their choosing and then can analyze the ciphertext output of the encryption algorithm. These can generally be stopped with good algorithm choices. So for example, AES with a 256-bit key length would be very effective in this case, and that's a symmetric algorithm used for bulk data encryption. So we have the ciphertext only attack, which is an attack model for cryptanalysis where the attacker is assumed to have access to only a set of ciphertext. So incidentally, RC4 and WEP are susceptible to this type of attack. So WEP is a very much a legacy protocol in protecting wireless networks. RC4 is a symmetric algorithm that's still used today, though I'd say AES would be preferred, like with WPA or WPA2 wireless encryption. So frequency analysis basically counts the number of times each letter appears in the ciphertext, with the knowledge that ETA, O, I, and N are the most common in the English language. So if those letters come up as the most common in trying to decrypt, you'd be working with a transposition cipher. And if not, it's likely a substitution cipher. So a substitution cipher would have basically a key, a map, and you're essentially replacing a letter with a different letter or a pair of letter or even triplets or mixtures of all the above. So again, here good defense is good algorithm choices. For example, in a wireless scenario, I'm going to use WPA2 and not WEP. And for 2021, if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to talk about quantum cryptography one-off, as we can expect that will begin to appear on the 2021 version of the CISSP exam. So I'd like to touch on mobile and wireless attacks you may see on the exam. So first up, there's bluejacking, which is really a bit of an annoyance type attack. So pranksters push unsolicited messages to engage or annoy nearby Bluetooth users. There's blue snarfing, which focuses on data theft using Bluetooth, and vulnerable devices are those using Bluetooth in public places with a device that's in discoverable mode, which in the public space is generally speaking going to be a no-no. And then there's blue bugging, which was actually developed about a year after bluejacking, and it creates a backdoor attack that compromises the device before returning control of the phone, for example, to its owner. So bluejacking is more of an annoyance attack. Blue snarfing focuses on data theft. Blue bugging originally focused on eavesdropping and eventually moved into also being used in a hacking context as well. And what I mean by that is blue bugging, if done right, will allow the attacker to access cell commands, phone calls, read and send SMS messages. So to prevent these types of attacks, you'll want to use a long PIN like an 8-digit PIN. You want to use a two-factor or MFA authentication. You want to disable discovery mode on your Bluetooth devices when you're in public spaces. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about some common network attacks. And I want to start with denial of service, which is a resource consumption attack. It's intended by design to prevent legitimate activity on a victimized system, to basically interrupt service. And then there's a distributed denial of service attack, which is a DOS attack that utilizes multiple compromised computer systems as sources of attack traffic, so allowing the attacker to scale up the attack, so to speak. And there are several countermeasures for denial of service attacks: firewalls, routers, intrusion detection, disabling broadcast packets that are entering or leaving your network, disabling echo replies, keeping your patches up to date so you're dealing with software and OS vulnerabilities. Bear in mind that denial of service and distributed denial of service are a class of attacks. They're not necessarily specific attacks. So let's talk about a few common denial of service attacks. But before we do, I want to touch on the concept of botnets, controllers, and bot herders. So bots represent significant threats because that's how a distributed denial of service attack is executed, with massive numbers of computers that can be used to launch attack. The botnet are a collection of compromised devices. A lot of times they're called bots or zombies. They can be computers, IoT devices, any sort of computing device that can be compromised and weaponized in that scenario. And then the bot herder is a criminal who essentially uses command and control to remotely control these zombies. And they generally use a botnet to launch attacks on other systems or to send spam or phishing emails. But it's a key component in a distributed denial of service scenario. So let's talk through a few denial of service attacks. So there's a SYN flood, which disrupts the TCP three-way handshake. If you're not familiar with the three-way handshake, stick with me for just a couple of minutes and I'm going to walk you through that and explain how that handshake works and point out a couple of points in the handshake that are commonly used in attacks. There's the Smurf attack, which employs an amplification network to send a number of response packets to a victim. So that is to say that Smurf attack is a distributed denial of service attack. So it's going to use multiple or many endpoints to implement that attack. Then there's the ping of death attack, which sends numerous oversized ping packets to the victim, basically causing a system to freeze, crash, or reboot. So I want you to notice here I'm giving you just key facts, key characteristics of each of these attacks to help you remember those, to anchor those in your memory for the exam. And these are not new attacks by and large, but newer attacks are often variations of older methods. In fact, you'll see some of the attacks I mentioned here and in just a moment in the denial of service area as legacy attacks. But newer attacks are often designed based on these older predecessors. So there's the teardrop attack, which is a denial of service attack that involves flooding a network with fragmented packets sent to a targeted device. But the key here is they're fragmented packets, and the receiving machine can't reassemble them due to a TCP IP bug, so essentially it winds up crashing the targeted device is the desired effect. So there's the Fraggle attack, which involves sending a large amount of spoofed UDP traffic to a router's broadcast address within a network. It's very similar to a Smurf attack, though a Smurf attack uses spoofed ICMP traffic. So remember, Fraggle is UDP, a Smurf attack is spoofed ICMP, but denial of service is the class of attack we're dealing with. And then there's the land attack, which is a layer 4 DOS attack where the attacker sets the source and destination info in a TCP segment to be the same. And any vulnerable machine is going to crash or freeze due to the packet being repeatedly processed by the TCP stack. And the target system is repeatedly processing that packet because the TCP segment has, for source and destination, has the same address. Now let's talk about that TCP three-way handshake that I mentioned comes up commonly in TCP IP-based network attacks. So with TCP we have a session-based protocol here, and here we have a source and destination system, two computers that are going to have a conversation. So the initiator sends out a synchronized packet, a SYN packet we call it. The recipient, the receiving system, is going to send back an acknowledgement, the SYN-ACK, and under normal circumstances, the initiator will then acknowledge the SYN-ACK was received, at which point we have an established TCP connection. In an attack scenario, what happens, say in the case of a distributed denial of service attack where bots are involved, they'll send out the SYN, but they'll never respond to the SYN-ACK, leaving this computer over on the right here with a bunch of half-open TCP sessions, so eventually just exhausting it of resources. So next we'll talk about impersonation or masquerading, which is the act of pretending to be someone or something you're not in order to gain unauthorized access to a system. Typically this means that authentication credentials have been stolen or falsified in order to bypass authentication mechanisms. Now there are several effective countermeasures here. One-time pads, token auth systems, encrypting traffic, employee awareness training, making sure your employees know not to give out their password if somebody were to call and ask for it, for example. So modification attacks. So this is where captured packets are then altered and replayed against a system. So they're essentially designed to bypass restrictions of improved authentication mechanisms and session sequencing. So ARP spoofing is sending ARP packets, which ARP works between layers 2 and 3 in the OSI model, across the LAN that contain an attacker's MAC address, also known as the hardware address, and the target's IP address. So the aim here is essentially to have traffic intended for the target redirected to the attacker. So you can use digital signatures, packet checksum verification to basically stop modification attacks. For ARP spoofing, packet filtering, ARP spoofing software, TLS, SSH, secure HTTP, so basically encrypted communication will be helpful in combating ARP spoofing. So let's talk about DNS attacks. So there is DNS poisoning, in which an attacker alters the domain name to IP address mappings in a DNS system, and they might redirect traffic to a rogue system or perform denial of service against that system. Just poisoning DNS with an incorrect name to IP mapping would perform a denial of service by sending the traffic to the wrong destination, so the desired service is no longer reachable. There's DNS spoofing, where an attacker sends false replies to the requesting system, basically beating the real reply from a valid DNS server. Now, there are a few effective countermeasures against these type of DNS attacks. You can, number one, only allow authorize changes to DNS. You can restrict your zone transfers to specified machines, or to and from specified machines, using only verified DNS forwarders, logging all your privileged DNS activity, all your DNS administrative activity. So let's talk about homograph attacks, which leverage character similarities in international domain names to register phony domains that appear legitimate to the naked eye. So for example, if we take example.com, I could replace the Latin A character with the Cyrillic A character, which gives me a different domain name that looks very normal to my end user, but it's going to take them to a very different destination. Now, there are some effective countermeasures here. So on the client side, modern browsers that use puny code. So puny code is a method of representing Unicode characters with the smaller ASCII subset. Another solution, less common solution, I think, would be to simply deny access to all iDNA sites. On the server side, we're really relying primarily on policies implemented by ICANN, and these generally prohibit international TLDs from containing non-Latin characters. So, bottom line, update your browser regularly. If you're using a modern browser that's up to date, you should, generally speaking, be in pretty good shape. So hyperlink spoofing. So this is similar to DNS spoofing. It can take the form of DNS spoofing or can simply be an alteration of the hyperlink URLs. And generally speaking, you would use the same precautions for hyperlink spoofing that you'd use against DNS spoofing. Although in the real world, we also see cloud services that will mask the URLs in emails and even in Office apps and test those links in a detonation chamber to ensure they're safe. That's what we see in the real world, but the exam know that the same precautions you use against DNS spoofing would happen in hyperlink spoofing. I just wanted to throw a bit of real world in there in case it comes up in 2021. Hyperlink spoofing attacks are usually successful because people just click the links, don't they? They don't really examine URLs very carefully most of the time. So phreaking may come up on the exam, which is an attack to circumvent the telephone system. This is a very old attack to make free long-distance calls, to disrupt service, to alter a phone system. The attacker is known as a phreaker, and this is an attack I don't think you're likely to see much in terms of questions about the finer details on the exam. A phreaker would use tools including a black box, red box, white box, blue box, and each of these had a specific function. I think more likely on the exam, you'd see questions related to threats surrounding business phone systems, a PBX. So IP phones can be entry points into your business network and are susceptible to data network attacks. So you want to use security features on VoIP systems to restrict system access, to restrict call types different users can make, so restricting the ability to make long-distance calls, for example, and to restrict call hours. And you'll also want to ensure that users delete sensitive voicemails when they're no longer needed. If we just think about the information management lifecycle, when you don't need data any longer, when you're no longer required to retain it, you delete it. Reduces our risk and our liability. So countermeasures in this case would be the same precautions and security controls that you'd employ to protect a typical computer network. So what do I mean by security controls? Well, I mean firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, applying updates regularly, restricting network access. So let's talk about access control attacks. So in the access control category, we have dictionary attacks, which is attempting to use all dictionary words to find the correct password. Brute force attacks, attempting to break a password by trying all possible words. So the effectiveness of this type of attack will depend on your password complexity, attacker tools and compute power, whether or not they're using rainbow tables. We actually talked about brute force a little earlier in the session, if you recall. And then spoofed logon screens, another access control attack, which is basically implementing a fake logon screen. And when a user attempts to log on, the screen will send the username and password to the hacker. So really, that's a breach of an application system or a web system. So So in that case, the methods we use to secure websites and web servers and then application servers would defend against this sort of attack. So sniffer attacks. So in a sniffer attack or a snooping attack, an attacker uses a packet capturing tool like a sniffer or protocol analyzer to read data that's sent over the network. And of course, attackers can easily read data sent over a network in clear text. So encrypting data in transit stops this type of attack. Spoofing attack, which is pretending to be something or something else. This is used in a number of attacks, including access control attacks. But in the access control context, it's to obtain credentials of users so they can spoof the user's identity. These could include email spoofing, phone number spoofing, IP spoofing. Many phishing attacks use spoofing methods. So protecting against phishing is going to go a long way towards stopping this sort of attack. So a social engineering attack is when an attacker tries to convince someone to provide information like a password or a username or to perform an action they wouldn't normally perform, like clicking a malicious link. And social engineers are often going to try to gain access to the IT infrastructure or the physical facility. They may often talk to that user directly, maybe not just communicating through email, but having a conversation to build trust and to attempt to gain that sort of information. And of course, user education is a big step in stopping social engineering attacks. Phishing is commonly used to trick users via email into giving personal information, user accounts, passwords, or clicking malicious URLs or opening malicious attachments in email. In fact, somewhere north of 90% of attacks start with phishing. There are multiple types of phishing attacks. You have spear phishing, which targets specific groups of users. And spear phishing attacks tend to be a little more sophisticated. Often you'll find that the attacker's done some research and they've created a malicious email that seems a little more realistic. Whaling is an attack that targets high-level executives, so high-value targets. Vishing uses VoIP technology, so voice-based. But phishing is really like the number one cyber attack most years, so know these three variants for sure. But the best defense for both of these attacks is security awareness training, user education. Certainly we have technical controls we can use to stop phishing attacks. You have basically edge defenses for email that will filter out suspect emails that may be phishing, that will detonate attachments to make sure they're safe. Microsoft has their Office 365 ATP is what you may know it as. Proofpoint. There are many third parties out there that have technical controls you can put at the edge, but the best defense I still think is security awareness training, user education. Access aggregation. So that's a type of attack that combines or aggregates non-sensitive information to attempt to learn something sensitive and then use that in an attack. We're going to hear about aggregation attacks when we talk about relational databases later. But you may see aggregation attacks in the access control context. It'll be a different type of information perhaps that's being aggregated. Definitely know the common access control attacks and the countermeasures for the exam though. So let's talk about Kerberos for just a moment. And we're still in the access control category here, but I wanted to touch on Kerberos because this is a very widely used protocol. It's the core of Active Directory authentication. The primary purpose of Kerberos is authentication. It allows a user to prove their identity. But in that sense, it goes beyond that because it also provides a measure of confidentiality and integrity. It uses symmetric key encryption. It doesn't include logging capability, so it doesn't provide accountability. Replay attacks are a common attack against Kerberos. And you'll hear about replay attacks in more than one spot in this session and how to defend against. Preventing access control attacks. Your password should be long, complex, changed periodically. There should be a strong password policy in place to enforce. Enforcing other measures like account lockout after X number of logon attempts is another good defense. For spoof logon screens, the best prevention is to have secure endpoints where fake logon screens can't be implemented, right? So secure your web servers, your application servers, use firewalls, etc. So cryptographic salts. So earlier we had talked about how attackers might use rainbow tables of pre-computed values to identify commonly used passwords. A salt is a random bit of data that's used to as an additional input to a one-way function that hashes a password. Adding salts to the passwords before they're hashed reduces the effectiveness of a rainbow table attack. So a rainbow table attack is a type of brute force attack, essentially. So multi-attack prevention, multi-factor authentication is great for a number of attacks. So a multi-factor authentication scenario leverages something you know, something you have. So something you know being like a PIN or a password, something you have being, say, a trusted device, something you are, biometric, like a fingerprint. And some systems will incorporate all three of these. So for example, when I log into Office 365, I supply a password, and then my second factor will require me to have my trusted device where I basically open the app with my thumbprint. So it incorporates all of these. At the very least, you want two-factor auth, but multi-factor authentication is going to be great prevention for phishing, spear phishing, keyloggers, credential stuffing, brute force and reverse brute force attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks. That second factor of authentication that ties that sequence back to something that user has in their hand or something that user is are very strong defense. Two somewhat legacy attacks I wanted to mention just in case they come up. The Tempest attack, which allows electronic emanations that every monitor produces to be read from a distance. This is going to be effective on CRT monitors, which are hardly around anymore. Shoulder surfing, for monitor displays is another effective attack for gathering things like usernames and passwords. For example, if a user has the password field unmasked on a web page. White noise attacks, broadcasting false traffic at all times to mask and hide the presence of real emanations. So these attacks all have something in common in that they require physical proximity in order to be successful. So if you have good facility access control, if you have a sign-in desk, etc., so not just anyone can wander into your office, you should be safe from this sort of attack, albeit when we have an attack that focuses on a CRT monitor, that's not going to be entirely relevant today. So now I want to talk about attacks that focus on the human element, where it's primarily human activity and intention that's involved. So we'll focus on collusion, fraud, espionage, and sabotage. So preventing fraud and collusion. So collusion is an agreement among multiple people to perform some unauthorized or illegal action. So to prevent collusion, we can implement separation of duties. So this is a basic security principle that ensures no single person can control all of the elements of a critical function or system, which means that in order to perform some nefarious activity against that system successfully will require the cooperation of multiple people. Job rotation, so employees being rotated into different jobs or tasks or having tasks assigned to different employees will allow potentially patterns to emerge, number one. So if we see malicious activities following someone through job rotation, that's a sign, right? This can also serve as a deterrent control, as one can realize they are being watched and they may be aware that pattern could appear following them as they perform malicious activities. So implementing these policies helps prevent fraud, basically by limiting actions individuals can do without colluding with others. Employees will be less likely to commit fraud if they have to discuss what they want to do with other people and to collaborate or to collude in order to do so. So espionage and sabotage. So espionage is when a competitor tries to steal information, and they may use an internal employee, but espionage is an activity that is initiated externally. And sabotage involves a malicious insider performing some sort of malicious activity because they've become disgruntled, or maybe they're attempting to take information with them to their next job. So know that the key differentiator between espionage and sabotage is espionage is initiated externally from outside the organization. Sabotage involves a malicious insider. So let's talk about a few countermeasures for limiting access and damage when we're talking about the human element. So need to know and the principle of least privilege are two standard IT security principles that are implemented in every secure network. They limit access to data and systems so that users and other subjects have access to only what they require. They help prevent security incidents, and they also help limit the scope of incidents when they do occur. And when these principles are not followed, security incidents are going to result in far greater damage to an organization. If we don't limit access, if we don't limit privilege, if we don't limit access to information to need to know, the blast radius is going to be larger, quite simply. Monitoring privileged operations. So privileged entities are trusted, and we know a malicious insider can abuse their privileges, right? So it's important that we monitor all assignment of privileges and the use of those privileged operations. So the goal is just to ensure that trusted employees don't abuse the privileges they're granted. And in fact, having that audit trail is a measure of due care that we've talked about in other videos. But monitoring these operations can also detect many attacks because attackers commonly use special privilege. So if we see special privileges being used in an unusual way, it may surface an attack in that respect because we are monitoring. So I actually talked about the audit trail in my talk on the CISSP mindset and talking about due diligence versus due care. So if you haven't seen that video on the CISSP mindset, go watch that video after this. I think you'll get a lot out of that one. So let's talk about computer crime for a moment. So that's a violation of law or regulation that's directed against or directly involves a computer. So there are 6 types of computer crimes. In a sense, these are categories of crime. We're not going to dig into specific countermeasures, but I wanted to make sure that you remember the core 6. You have military and intelligence, business, financial, terrorist, grudge, and thrill attack. So 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, 6 categories of computer crime. If you don't know what 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon is, look that up on the internet between lessons. That's a great palate cleanser before you move into your next video. So in domain 8 of the CISSP content, which is software development security, we'll see malicious code and application attacks. So I want to dig into this topic with you. So we'll start with attacks attackers use to exploit poorly written software. So there's the buffer overflow, which exists when a developer doesn't validate user input in a form to ensure that it's of appropriate size, because if it allows input that's too large, it can overflow the memory buffer. You prevent this with input validation. Make sure that the form input is of the appropriate size, length, and type, right? So if we're expecting numeric data, just only allow numeric values, right? Make sure that we don't have script tags and the like being injected there that can cause us other problems. A backdoor. This is an undocumented command sequence that allows individuals with knowledge of the backdoor to bypass normal access restrictions. This is usually used in development and debugging operations. However, there's no guarantee a developer doesn't leave that backdoor in the application when it goes on to production. So countermeasures here, there are a few to make sure that backdoor is not accessed or is gone altogether. So implementing firewalls or anti-malware, network monitoring, just a good peer code review can spot remaining back door in a system. So all of those could be effective. So continuing down the poorly written software, time a check to time a use. It's a timing vulnerability that occurs when a program checks access permissions too far in advance of a resource request. So file locking, transactions in a file system or an OS kernel are considered good countermeasures. This is a tough one to combat. Rootkit, which is escalation of privilege. So rootkits are freely available on the internet. They exploit known vulnerabilities in various operating systems, basically enabling attackers to elevate privilege. So keeping your security patches up to date is the best defense. And anti-malware software is another great defense. Anti-malware software will detect rootkits commonly. So a type of injection that uses malicious scripts called a cross-site scripting attack. So it injects scripts into otherwise benign and trusted websites. This occurs when an attacker uses a web application to send malicious code to a different end user. It occurs when web apps contain reflected input, meaning it's reflected back to the user as though it's normal and legitimate content. So in this case, your best countermeasure is input validation, just like we talked about with the buffer overflow. You want to validate your data length and your data type, and that'll filter out malicious input like a script tag, so preventing then cross-site scripting. So an attack that exploits user trust to execute code, that's a cross-site request forgery. It's similar to cross-site scripting attacks, but it exploits a trust relationship. It exploits trust that a user has with a website to execute code on the user's computer. So the countermeasures here are to create web apps that use secure tokens and sites that check the referring URL in the request to ensure that the requesting URL is the local site. So here's an attack that's used to compromise web front ends and back end databases. The SQL injection attack. You've probably heard about this one. It uses unexpected input to a web application to gain unauthorized access to an underlying back end database. And here again, input validation using prepared statements and limiting account privileges are all going to help here. So this is not a new attack. It can be prevented through good code practices, absolutely. But input validation, you're noticing is a common theme here. Prepared statements means prepared SQL statements. So if you're not familiar, a prepared statement is essentially it works like this. You've got a database that parses, compiles, and performs the query optimization on the SQL statement, and it stores the result without executing it. So it's the same every time. Stored procedures are another common way to deal with that. And I want to talk about aggregation versus inference attacks in the relational database context. I've had a couple of questions on aggregation versus inference. So an aggregation attack is the ability to create sensitive information by combining non-sensitive data from separate sources. So for example, if a cashier were to add up all of the daily sales totals from the receipts to come to the answer of the secret quarterly sales total. That's an aggregation attack. An inference attack is the ability to deduce or assume information from observing a non-sensitive piece of information. So for example, if I see a man in dark sunglasses and a black suit get off the bus in front of the White House, I might deduce or infer that he is a member of the President's Secret Service. So the key here is aggregation involves multiple pieces. Inference involves a piece of non-sensitive information. And we've talked about other attacks on relational databases like SQL injection, backdoor denial of service. It could all affect RDBMS, but I wanted to mention these two because they're a common source of confusion. So I hope those examples help sort that out. So let's talk about computer viruses. You're certainly going to want to be familiar with the different types of computer viruses. So a virus is a type of malicious code or a program written to alter the way a computer operates, and it's designed to spread from one computer to another. But computer virus is a class of threat with many types, and you'll want to know the key characteristics of the different types. So I'm going to call them out for you very quickly here and give you a nice anchor for each for the exam. So we have multi-part viruses, which use more than one propagation technique in an attempt to penetrate systems that defend against only one method or the other. We have stealth viruses that hide themselves by actually tampering with the operating system to fool antivirus software into thinking that everything's functioning normally. We have polymorphic viruses, which actually modify their own code as they travel from system to system. So they modify themselves to appear differently as they jump from one system to another in an attempt to avoid being recognized. Focus on just the key characteristics for the exam here so you can sort one out from the other should you be given a multiple choice question that gives you different options. So encrypted viruses use cryptographic techniques to avoid detection. Hoaxes, which aren't a virus at all. These are just a nuisance that result in wasted resources. This used to spread through email from a friend. It's now changed with social media how they spread, but we've all gotten that email from a friend in years past, warning of the big dangerous virus to end all viruses. Logic bombs are malicious code objects that infect a system and they lie dormant until they're triggered by the occurrence of one or more conditions. It could be the passage of time, so it could be the arrival of a specific date, for example, or when a specific program is launched or a website logon occurs. Trojan horse. So a Trojan horse is a software program that appears good and harmless, but it carries a malicious hidden payload that's designed with the potential to wreak havoc on a system or a network. So what's a good defense here? Well, only allow software from trusted sources. And in a business context, don't let users install just any software. Maybe don't let them install software at all. Do it for them with your endpoint management. So ransomware, one of the most common, dangerous, and costly attacks of today. It infects a target machine and then it uses encryption to encrypt documents and spreadsheets and files stored on the system with a key that's only known to the malware creator. And then the user is essentially just unable to access their files, and they're going to get some sort of message that warns them the files will be permanently deleted unless a ransom is paid within a short period of time. Ransomware is actually a Trojan variant. But ransomware has become very common in recent years, and there are a number of prevention techniques. The countermeasures: back up your computer, store backups separately, user awareness training. Cloud-hosted email and file storage. Cloud-hosted file storage will ease this process because many of your cloud storage systems will give you automatic versioning of your files, for example. So preventing ransomware: update and patch computers, use caution with web links, put protections in place that will potentially scan links in email and documents to make sure that they're safe before a user's taken to the end site. Use caution with email attachments. Teach users to be cautious about email attachments, which means user awareness training. Verify your email senders. Preventative software programs. Basically your AI-driven cloud security services will often help with these sorts of protections. They'll be built in. If you're using something like Office 365 or G Suite, you'll have some of these capabilities built into the system. Zero-day exploit. So that's an attack that uses a vulnerability that's either unknown to anyone, but the attacker, or only to a limited group of people. So really basic security practices can often prevent these. And because we're dealing with threats that are unknown there, really having AI-driven antivirus or what we call extended detection and response solutions, which will leverage user and entity behavior analysis. It will look at something other than a signature, right? It's going to be that AI-driven, that UBA-driven capability that will be very important. So word has it, the 2021 version of the CISSP exam may bring questions about post-quantum cryptography and quantum-resistant algorithms. So what is post-quantum cryptography exactly? Well, it's the development of new kinds of cryptographic approaches that can be implemented using today's conventional computers, but that will be resistant to attacks from tomorrow's quantum computers. So first two questions that come to mind are which algorithms are susceptible and which algorithms are resistant. Well, let's start by looking at the two classes, but first let me give you a quick disclaimer here. So number one, I am not a professional cryptographer, nor am I a professional cryptologist. However, I'm providing you information from solid authoritative sources, including the likes of Bruce Schneier, who you may know as a well-known public cybersecurity figure. He also happens to be the creator of the Blowfish and Twofish cryptographic algorithms, and Joel Alwyn, who's a pretty widely published cryptographer who puts some focus in the area of quantum. And I'll have links to both of their articles in the video description if you're interested in reading further. But moving forward, how well do current encryption algorithms hold up to the power of quantum computing? So let's take our two major types here: symmetric, which is shared key cryptography, and then asymmetric or public key. So symmetric, the shared key, is what we use for bulk encryption of data, and asymmetric has uses like key exchange and digital signatures. So symmetric holds up fairly well to quantum computing, and we'll explore that more in just a moment. Where quantum poses more immediate threats to asymmetric. So let's unpack symmetric first. So Grover's algorithm shows that a quantum computer speeds up attacks to effectively halve the key length. Grover's algorithm is a quantum algorithm for unstructured search that basically, with a very high probability, can identify the unique input for a given output. And basically that would mean that a 256-bit key is as strong against a quantum computer as a 128-bit key is against a conventional computer. And so you may ask yourself, well, wait a minute, a quantum computer is only twice as powerful as a conventional? No, a 256-bit key is not twice as strong as a 128-bit. The 256-bit key is 2 to the 128th times as strong, because doubling your length increases the possible combinations exponentially. So let's talk about asymmetric, so public key cryptography. So on this side, we have Shor's algorithm, which is a quantum algorithm for integer factorization, can easily break all of the commonly used public key algorithms based on both factoring, which means RSA is vulnerable because that RSA depends on factoring of large primes, and the discrete logarithm problem, which means that elliptic curve is vulnerable because that's the problem it's based on. So Schneier points out that doubling the key length in the asymmetric scenario increases the difficulty to break by a factor of 8, which is not a sustainable advantage. So the good news for the future here is that Lattice offers some resistance and some real promise for quantum-resistant algorithms. So it's based on different types of problems, the shortest vector problem and the closest vector problem. And according to Alwyn, it potentially enables us to replace essentially all of our currently endangered cryptographic schemes. And lattice-based cryptographic schemes make up the lion's share of scientific publications on post-quantum cryptography. And this bit of information comes from NIST's post-quantum cryptography competition, which they announced in 2016. And in July of 2020, so last year, NIST announced round 3 finalists. And the bulk of the finalists are of the lattice type. And that is to say, research, selection, and standards development is ongoing. And you might ask yourself, what exactly is a lattice? Well, a lattice is a three-dimensional array of regularly spaced points. An example of a lattice is the image you see right there. So for the exam, if you see a question asking for which types of public key algorithms are quantum resistant, the answer is lattice. So maybe you're interested to know about cryptography concepts on quantum computers, like how keys are exchanged in quantum, where you're using photons or using light. There's a great video called Quantum Cryptography in 6 Minutes available on YouTube. It's on the channel Up and Atom, and Jade is super entertaining. This is not at all expected on the exam. It's just for fun. If you're curious, it's just a great palate cleanser between lessons. So enjoy that. There's a link in the video description. And that is it for our drill down into attacks and countermeasures. I hope you're getting value out of the series. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe so you get a heads up every time I release a free CISSP exam Cram video. And until next time, take care and stay safe.